So last week finished talking about the leadership in the House and the Senate. So we talked about that, and today we were scheduled to start talking about committees and subcommittees. Now, we don't go into much depth on committees and subcommittees, but as we get to the final chart where we discuss the process the bill takes to become law, you'll see both of those in their appropriate places. All of the work that Congress does, for the most part, is taking place in committees and in subcommittees from those committees. These are the places where small groups of legislators are organized, either around topic, around relationship, in the sense to the House or the Senate, or around an issue, a current issue. And these committees are there to give opportunity for in-depth debate, discussion, considerations of both writing new legislation or updating legislation, as well as providing oversight and investigation. And so the Congress as a institution is responsible for all of those things. And the House and the Senate, of course, do all of the same things, but they're split between the House and the Senate, and they have to occur in both places. So the committees that you're going to see on both sides, right, the House and the Senate, are the four types that we have listed on this slide. Most of the work that we see is going to happen in either a standing committee or a select committee, and then a version of the conference committee. So standing committees are committees that are intended to stand for the duration of the legislative session. So when the legislature, right, House and Senate open up for business, right, they open up for a set amount of time that's laid out. And at the beginning of every legislative session, they are responsible at first for creating all the committees that are going to do work. The standing committees are committees that are routine, right? They're the ones that they always know they're going to need. They're the ones that they do most of their substantive work, their policy work in. And so they're going to build, both in the House and in the Senate, these committees on the environment, on education, on security, homeland security, on defense, on all of these major topical areas, policy areas, that they know they're going to have a committee and then maybe several subcommittees under it, where new legislation will come to be debated, crafted, compromised over, negotiated over, and then eventually voted on and either killed or promoted back out of the subcommittees to the committees, or out of the committees to the floors of the House and the Senate, or to other committees if necessary. So these are the places that the actual day-to-day work of small groups of legislators occur. And these standing committees are where you're going to see all of the legislation debated over, reports read, right, testimony given. And that's the kind of the nexus of where law comes from, is out of these committees, and these standing committees in particular, because every legislative session you're going to need a committee on defense, or a committee on budgeting or a committee on education, right? You're going to always have new legislation in those areas. So you're going to always build, right, a standing committee in those topical areas for those bills to go and be debated and worked on. And they get their name because they stand for the duration of the legislation of the session. So they're called a standing committee, and they're going to be there for that whole session. When that session ends and a new session begins, they'll create them again, and right, they'll serve on them again. And ideally, right, Congress folks will serve on these standing committees time and time again because they'll are essentially honing their own legislative knowledge and becoming subject experts in legislation that they've worked on in that area. So these standing committees are important, and most Congress folk are working to try to make sure they get on several of these that are going to be useful to their constituents back home, to their economy back home, to whatever they're, wherever they're coming from. They're going to try to get on committees that will help ensure that they're working on important legislation for their constituents. We talked last time when we were talking about leadership, how people, Congress people get assigned to these committees by either the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader, right? And then in conjunction with a few other folks working with them. So it's important to them that they get put on good committees, and these standing committees are ones that they know are going to be their legislative session after session after session. So they want to get on some good ones. Joint committees are any committee that has membership on that committee from both the House and the Senate. So anytime you see a committee whose name starts with the word joint committee of, right? That's telling you that they're both senators and House reps on that committee. You will see this a lot of times when there's some kind of need for the two to be together, whether that be an investigative reason or whether that be a reason as mundane as hammering out the differences between a House bill and a Senate bill. When they're doing it that way, when it's working over the differences between a bill and what got passed in the House and what got passed in the Senate, and they need to reconcile the difference in the language, that's also referred to as a conference committee. So the conference committees are joint committees whose job is to make those two different bills one again, right? So that they can hopefully be passed in the House and the Senate with the same language. So if you see a conference committee, you know that they're focused on working out legislation, and conference committees are joint committees, so you know they're both House members and Senate members there. And we'll point that out on the chart and how that makes sense as we move along. Other committee types that we see are referred to as select committees, or let's see, that's usually select committees. The idea behind those are the Congress as a whole, or the House, or the Senate individually, needs to do work on a specific issue. That issue may or may not have legislation tied to it, but they need to put some time and effort into something. So they will build a committee. A select committee is going to be given an authorization to exist for a limited amount of time, and it's going to be assigned to work on a very specific issue. And the point of that committee, when they meet, is to come out of that committee when its time is up with a report over that issue. If it's a select committee in the House, they're going to submit that report back to the House leadership. It's going to be then presented and made available to the members of the House to see what they found, what they researched, what they came out with, what the recommendations were. Quite often, A select committee is going to be put into place to quickly and deeply dive into an issue where they need either some very specific information, they need some oversight done. Maybe they're going to look into accusations of improper behavior for other members of the government. Usually, you will have a select committee that will work to provide the background information for a proposed impeachment process, right, where the House is looking to impeach somebody. And there will be a select committee on the Senate that's looking to receive that impeachment process and papers and background from the House and look into how they're going to start um, a Senate trial for that individual, or if they're going to start a Senate trial for that individual. So these are much more pointed, much more focused. They don't necessarily last for the length of a session. They may last for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever the leadership feels like they need would be an appropriate time for that committee to last. So they'll have a limited amount of time, be focused on a specific issue, generally with the directive to report back a finding of some kind about that issue. So, when something, some major event happens, and maybe the federal government is accused of not responding the way it should have or responding appropriately, quite often the result of that will be a select committee, maybe a joint select committee, created so that they can investigate what happened and did the government respond the way they were supposed to, and if not, what are some recommendations to handle that issue going forward. So these select committees are the ones that are created to handle things that kind of come out of the blue, in a sense, things that need attention that aren't anticipated every legislative session, whereas those standing committees are built specifically to work in policy areas that they know they're going to have continual work every session. So that when you look at committees in the House and the Senate, or joint committees between the two, you're going to see something in the name that tells you. If it's a select committee, it'll probably say that. If it's a joint committee or a conference committee, it will say that. If it's just a committee on a policy area, then you're probably looking at a standing committee. And there are hundreds of these, right? There are bunches of these between the committees and the subcommittees. Subcommittees are just smaller committees that are created out of a committee. So say you've got a standing committee on education, and then under education, they may want to have subcommittees that deal with educational policy areas, funding for education, educational loan, right? You may build a subcommittee to work on any of those areas, where they're still going to have multiple bills coming through those committees, but they'll be even more specific in their topic. And the subcommittees, again, can range through all of these types and go much deeper and much more specific into areas of interest. So what's funneling through these committees most of the time is, of course, legislation. And so in a legislative session, a year or so laid out for the Congress, you're going to see thousands and thousands of bills, prospective laws, right? Almost all of those are going to be assigned out to committee. Almost all of them, once they get to committee, will get some consideration. Most of them, though, will also not survive their time in a committee. Most bills are sent to committee, and that's where they die. They die because They just simply do not have either enough information, time, or it's not important enough. It doesn't have enough support. Right? There's something going on there that the committee looks at it, or the subcommittee looks at it and goes, sure, maybe this is important, but right now we can't see it. Right now we don't see a need to focus on it. There are other things that are much more important we need to put our time on, or they're just not ripe for legislation at this point. And so most of the legislation will die in the committees. That being said, of the thousands that are there, there will be more than enough that have support and have focus and have some drive behind them that the committee will not even have enough time to give all of them that they want to give time to give attention to. And it's always that way, right? You don't have committees sitting around waiting on stuff to look at. There's always more to look at and more to consider than they got time to do. When they're not looking at legislation, they're also serving on committees that are going to be providing oversight. And we're not going to spend a lot of time, right, talking about the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy's job as part of the executive branch is to implement legislation. So when they do pass law, Congress does get a law passed, the president signs it, the executive branch's job is to take that legislation and make it work. While they're doing that, it is then Congress's job to provide oversight to ensure that what is being done by the executive branch, by the bureaucracy, is what they wanted. That they're spending the money the way they want them to, that they're meeting the goals that they want them to. And they use, right, the committee process and these groups of smaller focused legislators who know, right, the intricate workings of the bills that they passed up to the floor that finally became law. These folks that worked on, word for word, sentence for sentence, those are the ones that are going to be have enough background knowledge to be looking at the bureaucracy going, do you recall us looking at it that way? Because I kind of thought we were trying to get them to do this. And so their oversight is certainly going to be, watching this process and then reaching out and saying, hey, not what we intended, or why aren't you doing it like this? We wrote this legislation to say X, and that doesn't look like what we had in mind. So in that sense, it's their job to not only pass the legislation, but then to later oversee that legislation's implementation. Now, the bureaucracy doesn't answer to Congress, it answers to the president. So when the president tells the bureaucracy to do this, that they're out there doing it the way they're told. But the legislature has the ability, one, in that they control the budget, and two, that they can pass more legislation to continually force the executive branch and bureaucracy to refocus and do things the way they're trying to get them done. So when the system is working the way it's supposed to, there's actually a good bit of communication between Congress and the bureaucracy as they're working through legislation and the implementation process. And if it's being done right, there's a lot of communication on the front end of legislation between committees and the bureaucracy about, we're looking at writing this way to try to get this done. Can you do that, right? Is that possible? And the bureaucracy's job is to be looking at, okay, here's what we're seeing, and here's what our restrictions are, and here's how we would do this in the past, and is this what you mean? So that oversight is if it's working the way it's supposed to, a lot of back and forth communication to ensure that how legislation is written is achievable by the bureaucracy. Now we know on the back end that a lot of times what people think is achievable and what they write up and what gets actually implemented are different things. So despite all this communication between the committees and those that are implementing, it doesn't always work out. All right, and I've already mentioned, right, the assignment to committee assignment is important to each of the individual Congress folk, because if you're from Southeast Texas, it would be really, really useful for you to get on a committee to have something to do with the economy of Southeast Texas, right? Whether that's going to be oil and gas, whether that's going to be agriculture, or fisheries business, or something, something, right? Maybe some tourism. So you don't want to be from a congressperson from Southeast Texas and get stuck on something like mining, right? Where most of your concerns are going to be around coal and uranium and gold, none of which occurs in Southeast Texas, right? So while that's important, and as a congressperson, you might be needed sometime to work in that area, that is not the committee assignment you want, right? So you want to be working energy, oil, gas, right? Space, right? NASA, something like that. You want to be working over issues that are going to be a large part of your economy and what your constituents are paying attention to. If you're out of the Dallas area, you're going to be looking at finance, right? West Texas, you're back to oil and gas, or agriculture in the sense of ranching, or crops or something. So these committees, right, because especially the standing committees, are developed around subject areas that the legislation is going to be focused in. You want to get on one that has you working on legislation that's pertinent to your constituents. I'm not going to play this. If we were in class, I would play the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill, for you. You can follow this link on your own and listen to I'm Just a Bill, or YouTube, Google it on YouTube and play it. Right, this is the old Schoolhouse Rock song about how a bill becomes a law. It's a little entertaining. It's a little throwback, so it's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun. It's also accurate. It's not accurate to the deepest levels, right? It's a very high level skim over the bill, over how a bill becomes a law. But it's something that you can get stuck in your head. This, however, is a lot more accurate and a lot more in depth. There are quite a few charts that you can find that describe how a bill becomes a law. This one, I think, is probably deeper than most of us need, but if you're trying to figure out how it works, this one will do it for you, right? And so I put this one in here. It takes you on the normal path that legislation is submitted to become a law, which means it's going through the House first, which has a lot more resources because there are a lot more people. And if it survives the House, is sent over to the Senate. The break there between the House and the Senate is this white line right here, right? So this is all housework here. And let's see if I can zoom in a little closer. There you go. You can see that, right, kind of where legislation can come from. These are typical areas that the ideas for legislation will come from. The only place that a bill really gets its start, though, is from a representative, either a representative in the House or a senator in the Senate. So when you're seeing state legislature, you're seeing the people, you're seeing executive branch, All of these, of course, are places where discussion can happen and an idea can be put out there, but you're going to see a representative physically put a bill into the hopper, create a bill, and submit it to the House. Notice you've got lobbyists up here, right, that are going to be kind of part of this. Remember, lobbyists are working for interest groups, going to be talking to representatives. So anyway, you get an idea, you get a bill, it gets written up, it gets submitted. So the legislation, right, starts here, starts in the House, and it comes in, gets written up, it gets introduced to the House. And here's where a lot of stuff is still needs to be just a little bigger, I think. So we've got a lot going on right here at this beginning thing section right here. We talked about joint resolution. I mean, a joint committee. Joint resolution is a resolution that's going to be just like a committee between the House and the Senate. A concurrent resolution and a joint resolution and a simple resolution. These are not legislation. So, except a joint resolution can be, because you'll use a joint resolution to submit a constitutional amendment. They come into the legislation, called a resolution if it's not going to be new law. Joint resolution, it's going to be proposed amendment. This is where it's going to be kind of read into the to the House. It's going to be said, okay, here's what we are. This is the bill, House Bill 1521. They'll read the preamble to it, which gives a high level discussion of what the bill is. And then you see the very next step is to assign it to a committee, right? So you write the legislation, you introduce it to the House. The House, as a organization, there's not everybody's in there listening to this every time, but right, it gets read into the record, it gets assigned to a committee. And then that's where the work happens, right? This is where you have the committee comes together, the bill gets debated, it'll go on a public docket at some point. People can come into that and testify. You'll bring in experts, you'll bring in people from the executive branch, from the bureaucracy, you'll bring in the lobbyists, you'll bring in specialists from colleges and universities that do research in that area, and people from the business areas that have researched it. That's where all of this information comes into the process. Markup is the period where you're starting to change the wording, right? You're starting to say, okay, we've looked at all this, we've heard all this testimony, we've read all this background information. What started off saying let's do A, B, and C, we're figuring out we really just need to focus on A and C, so let's rewrite this. B is a different issue. We'll ignore that, right? We'll write it out. You have all the debate, you have all the changes to it, the amendments, the strikeouts, so whatever you're going to do to it. The committee or the subcommittee, if it goes down to one, will be working here. They'll vote. If it survives that, right, it goes to a special kind of committee called a calendar committee. And a calendar committee's job is to schedule committees for debate, amendment on the House floor. And so they put it on the calendar. This big orange area here is all of the same thing kind of that went on here in the committee, except that it's not as in-depth a lot of times. You're making your pitch now to the House as a whole, trying to get the House to say that, you know, they're for it. If it survives that, right, you're going to see it come over here into the area where they're going to try and apply some kind of appropriations to that bill. to ensure that either the bill is passed with appropriations or there are appropriations in the budget bill that will support that bill once it's passed. And so you got to get that all reconciled so that those separate pieces of legislation work together. If it passes all of that and comes out of the House and is ready to go, then it will be introduced as a Senate bill by a senator right here. It'll switch from the House to the Senate. You will essentially go through all of the same steps. In the middle of that, right, if the Senate works their way through it and says they want to pass something that was there too, this is where the conference committee comes back in to iron out the differences, right? And if it survives that and the House and the Senate decide that, right, it's what comes out of this is good, they both pass it, then it can be enrolled, which means it's going to now, crossing this white line, shift from Congress, House, white line, Senate, white line, President. And that's where the president's going to come in and play their role in signing the bill into law or possibly vetoing that bill if they don't want to see it. And so if the president signs it, it becomes law. If the president vetoes it, then the House and Senate have the opportunity to try to override that veto. If they do, then and they get the requisite 2/3 majority vote, then they can override the veto and make it law. So that's the process. It's long, it's complicated. Spend some time with this chart. Make sure you understand how this is all working. Like I said, if this chart doesn't really work for you, there are others out there that you can look up on the interwebs and find, and it'll be useful. But I think this is the clearest one that goes to the depth I think is appropriate. Any questions about that? And that's our last one on Congress. So now would be the time for any congressional questions as I'm loading up the presidential slide deck. If not, we'll move right on into it, and fairly appropriate, right, for where we're at right now. We've been focused on the presidency for a good long while. And it looks like, from now until most of January, this is going to be our governmental focus as we see a transition from one presidential leadership to another presidential leadership. So finally, yes, it is. It always takes this long. We just don't usually pay attention to it because we're just not concerned about it usually, right? In almost all of history, right, once the writing is firmly on the wall, presidents have been pretty good about conceding more quickly. That being said, all of this stuff that we're paying attention to now, that takes through the middle of December, is always happening. It's always been there. We just haven't focused on it because we weren't concerned about anything changing. Although it has always had the potential to, right? Usually a day or two after the election, maybe the next day after election, if it's done. We see the vote tallies. The media has looked at with their, because they have specialists that this all they focus on. They've looked at all the potential possible solutions of the absentee ballots and the provisional ballots and the countings that are left. And they've, using statistics, have come to a very high level understanding of what's possible and what's not. And so the media calls the election. Well, what that means is that the media says, providing something really, really weird and out of the ordinary doesn't happen, here's the results of the election that we will see. And then most of us, right, go, okay, the election's over, and we're waiting until January for a new president or to be sworn in, or another president to be re-sworn in for their second term. All of the minutia that we're seeing right now of recounting ballots and finding some ballots here and there that weren't counted the first time, and states doing certification of the election and the counts, and doing some recounts and some auditing. This always happens. It's just usually not focused on as a potential game changer, because it's not usually, and it truthfully doesn't appear to have been possible that it was going to be a game changer this time either. Just the emphasis is being put on it by President and the Republican Party this time. That has been a different focus than before. But we've always seen hundreds to thousands of votes shifting from election day through certification process. In December, we're going to see the Electoral College cast their votes. The assumption has always been that those electors will follow the will of the people from their state and will vote following the will of the people of their state. Every now and then there's one elector here or there that doesn't and votes if it's allowed by their state, right? Maybe votes without any kind of penalty, different than what their folks wanted. But again, it's never enough to make a difference. And if you're paying attention, you'll see a write-up saying there was a faithless elector from so here or a faithless elector from there, right? And but we're not, we've just moved on. This time we're watching every step of the process, right? And it's tedious. There's a lot to it. Yeah, usually as soon as the concession by the president is made, right, or the concession from, if it's not a president, in this case president, right, in the other place it would be like last session, right, you have an outgoing president who wasn't eligible to be reelected. When Obama said, right, because Hillary Clinton had conceded already, Obama said, let's start, right? That usually happens right away. Now, the GSA, General Services Administration, is part of that bureaucracy that I was talking about just a minute ago, and they work for the president. So there's always been a behind the scenes, hey, GSA, start the transition process from the president that's in charge. They didn't get that this time until yesterday. So in that sense, they were waiting for the president to tell them to do it. In the past, it's just kind of been assumed that that once the concession happened, and because the concession happens, usually within a day or so, right? Not really. The legislation or the write-up that occurs, the rules, the GSA rules that surround releasing money for a transition, gives that authority to the actual head of the GSA, and it says basically when the director of the GSA acknowledges that a transition is going to occur, those funds may be released. Now, again, the head of the GSA is appointed by the president. So the president is their boss. I do not ever recall in the past seeing anything, communication from the president to the GSA director saying do this. That doesn't mean it hasn't been there. It certainly never occurred in a tweet before that we're acknowledging that. And it didn't, the actual start of that didn't occur with the tweet this time either, but when she tweeted that they were going to start doing that, there was a presidential tweet that then followed up saying, yes, I've made this right happen, making it appear as if she was specifically waiting for Trump to say, do this. It doesn't have to be the case. The rulemaking that's in place that tells the GSA how to do their job tells them that once there's an acknowledgement of who the either president-elect is, they can go forward and start the transition process. So she probably could have done that on her own authority. The day after the election, 2 days after the election, maybe. Certainly as soon as the first recounts, maybe in Georgia or something, happened, right? She didn't have to wait on a lot of the litigation to start playing out. So, essentially we've had 2.5 weeks of time, at least 2 weeks, where transition could have, Biden's team could have already started getting in place, could have started looking at reports, could have started moving into some temporary offices and getting phones set up and emails set up and things that are going to take a little bit of time. That could have already started, and now they're a couple weeks behind on that. So that's, I think this is the latest that I've ever been aware of as far as the transition starting. Even with Bush Gore, when we had court cases going on until middle of December, the transition process was set up so that regardless of the result, whoever won was going to have their people on boots on the ground and starting to work sooner rather than later. Now, again, it's not until the end of January, the 20th, 22nd, somewhere in there, when we do the swearing in, that new administration takes over at noon, right? So, but it takes that long to get everybody in place and get everybody doing what they need to do. So, every day and certainly every week is important in ensuring that this works the way it's supposed to. And there's going to have to be a lot of people on the ground working well before the 20th, interacting with other countries and other leaders and all of the governors and all of the parts of the federal government's touching. All of that needs to be kind of seamlessly being funneled in there, so that when the new president takes over on inauguration day, that there's not a month where they're trying to figure out what they're doing and who's doing it. And generally, we've been really good about this. So, it's the lack of a concession from Trump. It's the litigation that's been instigated by Trump has put so much uncertainty into the situation this time. It slowed that all down. I don't think there's anything that's going to be, terrible because of this, but it's just not the norm, right? And you see a lot of folks that are really agitated because there's a fairly well-defined process of how this changeover has happened, administration to administration, and lots of documents and processes and laid out, and they're not getting to follow them, and they're looking at well, we've always had 60 days or 65 days or 90 days to do, and now we don't, right? And And for bureaucrats, it's a little unnerving, right? You've got a whole set of rules that you're ready to start following, and you're just waiting. I can speak about that from personal experience, right? Things are going to change, and you want to get that jump on it. So let's talk about the presidency. Obviously, this is a position that gets an immense amount of attention, most of it deserved. But it's probably one of it is probably the biggest visible sign of leadership in our country, and it is one of the biggest leadership positions in the world. Quite often, right, our president is referred to as the leader of the free world, although that is debatable at this point, right? We've seen other leaders of democracies trying to make a play for that in the last few years, and generally we look at the president because of the military and economic powers that they're leader of as one of the most powerful person, if not the most powerful person alive. So picking someone to be in this position is putting them a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. It's giving them an awful lot of power to make things happen. And so we need to pay a little bit of attention to this office and what's going on there. Presidents, right, although we look at them this, as certainly incredibly powerful office, and the person that fills them having a lot of opportunity to do things on their own, most everything that they have to do requires them to actually be working with other folks. There are very few areas where the president can just literally do what they want to do without anybody having any say about it. They're strong. They have a lot of abilities. I'm not saying they don't. But everything they do, everything they do, there are places in the system, people within the system that can act as governors or limits upon presidential power and how it's exercised. So if the system is working the way it's designed, there are lots of checks and balances in place to keep this powerful, very public, out front leadership position working with the rest of government, not working on the rest of government. There's, as we've seen in the last 4 years, right, been a great reliance upon norms, customs, and practices that presidents have followed, historical norms that they have followed, that we're finding out that that's right with this current president, not enough, right? And so have seen in the last 4 years, right, a president that's been challenging these checks and balances has been has seen as one of their mandates from the people to get things done regardless of the bureaucracy or in spite of the bureaucracy, and right, trying to force Congress to move along with them. This isn't the first time it's ever happened. It's just the first time in a long time we've seen it. That the office of the president, right, has been filled with someone that's trying to challenge the norms and practices of history. You can tell that as much as this president wanted to get things done, there were a lot of bumps in the road. There were a lot of things that he thought he could get done that he couldn't without help, and he didn't get help in a lot of those instances. And that's because this office is intended to be a leadership position, but is not intended to be the sole leadership position. So the president shares power to get most things done. the president relies upon experienced people that have been there to carry out their orders. They rely upon a working relationship with Congress. Um, the president does not have the ability to just make things happen most of the time. They make things happen when they've got a group of folks that are working with them that are going the same direction. President can't put new legislation into place without Congress. The president can't change the intent of legislation, or he could be held in contempt of court if the court finds that he's doing something unconstitutional. President does not have control over the purse strings of government, so they cannot authorize money to be spent where they want to spend it. So when it comes down to actually operating the machinery of government and getting things done, the president has to work with people. That being said, the last 4 years have shown us that a strong personality in this office can, shake, rattle, and roll the machinery to get things kind of going the way they want to go sometimes. And if Congress specifically is not up to the task of saying no, stop, they will move government the directions they want to. So there's a lot of opportunity to lead there. There's not a lot of constitutional power behind the office to make the rest of government do what they want. And it's intended to be that way, right? The last thing the framers of the Constitution wanted was the president to be one step away from a monarchy, right? That's exactly what they were concerned about. And so the idea of trying to make this country's leadership office work with the elected representatives from all the states was intended, to hamstring their ability to easily make government do what they wanted to. And frankly, if the House and the Senate are on the same page, the president's going to have a lot of work to do if they want to go against that. They're not going to be able to pull that off very well. What does give the government some power, the president some power, is the people, right? We, American people as a whole, want to see our presidents, one, be successful. We want to see them be leaders. We want to see them be laying out a clear objective for us as a nation and taking us that direction, right? We expect them to be that most powerful person in the world. We expect them to be the leader of the free world. We expect them to be able to lead not just our country, but other countries as we move forward. And so at times when we feel like the president's not filling those roles very well, we get a little nervous about whether they're a good leader or not. One of the things I think you have to give Donald Trump credit for is that he did step up into the role of trying to be a strong leader. I wouldn't give him decisive, because a lot of the things he did went one direction and then went a different direction pretty quickly, and that's not very decisive. But in relation to maybe Barack Obama, you saw a strong voice, an attitude of this is what we're going to do as a country, and a lot of people respond to that because there's a desire to see our country out front and leading, and a strong president is a symbol of that. On the other hand, we still have in the back of our heads that same thought that our framers of the Constitution had, in the sense that our president needs to be strong and decisive, but they still have to work with government, right? They're not the leader. They're not the decision maker. They are part of a process. And so, we want to see them laying out clear ideas and where they want to go, but we want to see their leadership being demonstrated by getting Congress to work with them, by convincing all of those folks from different states that this is the way the country needs to go. So we have intentionally, our framers did, and we can still see this and believe in this, that we've divided power to get things up so that it requires Congress and the presidency to work somewhat unified to be successful. We're not going to put all of our political power in one part of the political system, namely the presidency. We don't want our president to be able to just make a decision and the government jumps up and does it without reflection, without some kind of consideration, debate, and discussion from other parts of the government. About the only place that doesn't apply is in national security. We have given over time and probably with some good experience and good reasoning, a lot more leeway to the president to be a strong leader on their own authority in the areas of national security. We don't want to have to work our way through the legislative and congressional process to make a decision on whether we retaliate after we've been attacked by someone, right? Those are usually things that we need a quick decision on. So we've, through practicality and experience, have let the president actually come to own a large part of that decision-making process in that area. And we'll talk about that some more as we move through this chapter. Constitutional requirements are bare bones. There's not a lot here, right? If you want to be president, the requirements you need to meet are nominal. You need to be a natural-born citizen. Before you're sworn in, you must be at least 35 years old. You must have lived in the United States for 14 years, and you have to have won an election, right? All of that's pretty straightforward, except the natural-born citizen part of it. That's still somewhat debatable. Most of our presidents, right, it's not been an issue, right? They're born in the United States, and right now, right, being born in the United States is what, right, definitely gives you puts you in the position of being a natural-born citizen. So, anybody born within the boundaries of the 50 states, that certainly is easily provable. Well, you would think it's easily provable, right? We had a good bit of time where there was argumentation over, by some factors, my current president over our previous president, right? Whether President Obama was a natural-born citizen. And people kept trying to make hay out of this idea that, well, his parents, right, his dad was from Africa, from Kenya. And maybe he wasn't born in the United States, despite birth certificate, hospital declarations, right, of him being born in Hawaii. Usually, it's not that hard, right? You're born in the States, you're born in the States. Yeah, that's a good one, right? Good question, Colton. What about the U.S. territories? The presumption is that they would count. Being born in the U.S. territories would probably work. And the reason is that we have historically made the argument, although we've never tested it yet, that if your parents are U.S. citizens, right, where you're born might not matter quite as much. So we've had several presidential candidates that were not born in the United States, right? And not much was made out of whether or not they were natural-born citizens or not. So Mitt Romney, right, was born in Mexico, if I remember correctly. John McCain was born in Panama. Now they were, John McCain, Panama at the time was a U.S. territory, right? Uh, Romney, his parents were U.S. citizens, even though he was, I think, born in Mexico, right? Might have been born on, I'm trying to remember where. Anyway, right, both of them ran for president, and not much was said about whether they were natural born citizens or not. Could have been challenged in court, certainly. And if they'd have been elected, maybe it would have been. Um, Although probably not, right? Um, McCain was born in Panama when the U.S. had control of it. So, yes, that would have been on a U.S. controlled territory. But I thought Romney was born in Mexico, and I don't think we have any military bases in Mexico. So you can Google check me on that one, right, on the Romney one. Um, so the idea, of course, when it was written, was that we didn't want folks not born in the continental United States, right, that were born maybe in England and might be considered, right, loyal to the English monarchy, to be our president. Um, that, of course, is well past now. Um, and we do have, I mean, if you were born on a military base in Germany, U.S. military base in Germany, and that means that one of your parents is in the U.S. military, maybe both. You're a U.S. citizen, right, when you're born there. The debate is whether you're a natural born citizen. Um, and we don't really know, is the answer to that question. We've not had the court case to define that. Yes, some of them are still there, I believe, and I think that's where Mitt was born, and then his family came back relatively early in his life. And he's, certainly spent almost all his life as a U.S. citizen, and has been in U.S. government for a long time. And there's, if he had won the election, right, like we'd have had a debate, right? Is he really a U.S. citizen or not? I mean, not a U.S. citizen, but a natural born citizen. And should that, right? Should where you're born really be the decider? The Constitution says yes. So now, if we were to take it before that issue before the Supreme Court, which is made up of originalists at this point, right? There's 6 of them, and they're going to say, right, natural born citizen. What did it mean in 1778, 1779, right? What did it mean when it was a term of art, legal term being used 250 years ago? And that would mean at that point that you were, well, even there, it's still debatable. I did a little bit of diving on this a few years ago, researching on this. And even if you did the historical term, it's an English law term, right? It has been debated that it meant you were under the authority of the monarch. Even that doesn't necessarily say you were born in the country, right? Although that's what we've typically meant for it to be interpreted as. I think, right, this is something that's probably going to be up for change, at least discussion for that. Trump is putting the idea out there that he's going to try through executive action to change the requirements for what it is to be an a U.S. citizen, and to move away from a birthright, a birthplace-based citizenship to a birthright or citizenship, meaning you're not a U.S. citizen just because you're born in the United States. You have to be born, one of your parents has to be a U.S. citizen. If we move away from that to saying you're a citizen if one of your parents is a citizen, regardless of where you're born, then the next following argument is maybe a constitutional change to get rid of natural born citizen. or maybe not. Maybe we'll debate that. So, but it's not as clear cut as we think it is because we've never had anyone elected yet um, that wasn't natural born in the sense of born within the states, the boundaries of the states of the U.S. I think we might have had one of our presidents or a couple of our presidents born in some of the Western territories, but by the time they got elected president, those territories had become states. So in that sense, there wasn't there was that much of a debate over it. So not as settled as we think it is. Kind of interesting little piece of history there. Um, what have our presidents looked like? Well, that's real easy. Um, they've all been male. Most of them have been white, and most of them have been Protestant. Right. So actually, we have right only had one that wasn't white, Caucasian, and we have our second in President-elect Biden that is not a Protestant. JFK and Biden both being Catholic. So, right, we're not even debating that or talking about that, but it's kind of a big deal, right? It was a much bigger deal when Kennedy was elected as our first Catholic president. There was actually talk going around about, well, can we elect a Catholic? Because will a Catholic be under the authority of the Pope, and are we electing someone that's going to do what the Pope tells them to do, or will they actually be right the American president? And there was real open talk and discussion about that when JFK was elected, and I didn't hear any of that with Biden this time. Right. So it looks like that debate or issues kind of moved along. Well, how do I phrase this accurately? To the best of our knowledge, there's never been an avowed atheist elected president. I would argue historically, looking at some of our framers, quite a few of them would be called atheists today if we really talked about what they believed and what they talked about what they believed. The ones that we refer to as deist essentially were folks that were of the opinion that nature as a whole was God. And in that sense, they weren't atheists because they believed there was this godly presence in nature, but it wasn't anything anywhere remotely the same as a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jewish perspective on a God. And if someone were today say that was their religious belief, that they were a deist, they would be called an atheist, or maybe a pagan or something. They wouldn't be considered the mainstream religious perspectives. Have we ever had anyone who says I'm an atheist, I don't believe there is a God, period? Not in those words. Although I would have to say that Trump's historical life is shown no affinity for religion at all. No arguments, beliefs, writings, or anything that points to belief in God until he ran for president. And in that sense, I mean, we've probably at least, right, we're seeing our first non-believing person as president. Whether I don't think he's an avowed atheist in the sense that I'm not sure he's ever given thought to it, to be honest. He doesn't go to church. Until he started running for office, he never talked about religion from any of the writings or interviews that I've seen. He's never been a member of a church. Never had his children brought up in a church or baptized or anything that I'm aware of. There might be some history that I've missed, but if anybody's lifestyle is ever shown don't believe in a religious perspective. It's been his up until it became useful as a political tool. Um, and so we'll see. We know that we have a couple avowed atheists in state legislatures. We I don't know that we have any currently in Congress. Um, Popularity of atheists is really, really low. Um, there's only you can be a communist and probably get more political support running for office than you could as an atheist. Um, and that's slowly changing, but it's not much, right? So, um, but that's where we are. Okay, time to stop. We'll pick up with this Barber's typology tomorrow.